What's up developers, and welcome back to a new video where we will add GitHub login through Laravel Socialite on our Laravel Breeze authentication system. Quick pause. I'm currently working on a new Udemy course where I will dive into Laravel databases and Eloquent. If you think that there is a topic that should most definitely be included, feel free to drop it down below in the comment section. If you would be interested in the course or you want to support the channel, make sure that you follow me on either Twitter, Instagram or YouTube to be the first one to find out when the course gets released. I have already installed a default Laravel scaffolding project where I have added Ray as a composer package. Ray is a paid application which will help you to debug your application, and it has been created by Spazi. I will be using Ray during this tutorial to make debugging a little bit easier. If you don't use Ray, don't worry, it's not a magic application that will write your code. Whenever I use the Ray command, just replace it with a die dump, and you will mostly get the same output. Before we could add Laravel Socialite or do anything with it, I want to make sure that we install Laravel Breeze to pull in Laravel's authentication system, which needs to be done right inside of the CLI. We're going to add Laravel Breeze through Composer, so we need to say Composer require a package from Laravel /Breeze. And we will be installing it in development mode, where we need to make sure that we add the --dev flag right to it. If we hit enter, Composer will pull in the Breeze package. This will take a moment, and it's done. Then we need to make sure that we run the php artisan breeze install command. I'm going to add a flag right here because I recently found out that Breeze has dark mode. So let's add a dark flag. What this will do is basically publishing the views, routes, controllers, and other resources. And this is definitely needed for us since we do need to make some changes in a couple of those files. The next logical step right here is running the php artisan migrate command. But I prefer to make changes inside the user's migrations before I run the command, since we need to pull in Laravel Socialite later, perform some actions to interact with GitHub, and eventually save information from GitHub inside our own database. And before we could do that, we do need to make sure that we add a couple additional columns inside our user's migration. So what we could do right here is navigate back to PHP Storm and let's search for our users _table migration right here. Now let's go right below our name and let's define a new table right here with a data type of string, so basically a varchar. The column name right here will be nickname and the column is nullable. When users register inside our application, it is not required to add the nickname. This could be added after logging in right inside of the dashboard. But since GitHub users have a nickname, it is possible to import the same nickname from GitHub, but it needs to be nullable first. Right below our password table, we're going to add another table where the data type will be a string as well with a column name of GitHub _ID. You might think, why don't we add an integer as a column type? Because we're going to work with an ID right here. And that's simply because we can't control what's coming from GitHub. And if in the future the GitHub ID will change to a mix of characters and numbers, we will run into issues right here. Therefore, I prefer to work with a string right here, because it's better to be safe than sorry. Now users have the option to either log in through the Laravel Breeze authentication form, or click on a GitHub icon which we will add, which will then log you into GitHub. Therefore, the GitHub ID should be nullable as well, because it's not required for every single user. Finally, we're going to add one more table right here, with a data type of string as well, and the name of the column will be auth_type. And the auth_type is basically a confirmation whether a user is using GitHub, Google, or another platform to log in. This won't make sense for now since we're only using GitHub, but it is very easy to add, let's say, Google login with Laravel Socialite. Therefore, it's always good to add the authentication type of a user. Now that we have added 3 new columns inside our users table, we are ready to migrate it. Now before we do that, make sure that you have your database credentials set up correctly inside your .env file. Then you're ready to navigate to iterm and run the php artisan migrate command. Alright, Breeze is installed and our migrations are set up. The only step left is compiling our frontend assets. So let's run the npm install command and let's add a $& since we're going to directly run the npm run dev command after. If we hit enter, it might take a moment. Alright. I also want to quickly add the 3 added columns inside our user model, since we do need to perform mass assignment. So let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's search for our user model. And right inside of our fillable property, the order doesn't matter, but for my mental it does. So right under name, let's say nickname. And then right under password, we're going to add the GitHub_ID and also the auth_type. Now let's navigate to the browser and let's refresh it. And in the top right, you'll see a login and register button. Let's click on login for now. Alright, Laravel Breeze, its beautiful scaffolding has been pulled in. And what I want to do right here is adding a GitHub logo right above my email input field, where a user can click on, which will then redirect them to the GitHub login page. So let's navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's open the resources directory, views, auth, where we have a login.blade.php file, which is basically the page you're seeing right here. We are going to define a new div right above our session status right here. The main div will have a class of text center. Then we need to define an answer right inside of it, where the href will be empty for now, since we haven't defined the named route yet. But inside the answer, we're going to define an image tag, where the source will be an image that I include in the description down below. So please copy it now that I'm doing it, and I'm pasting it right here, so you should do the same as well. Then we have the alt tag, which will be GitHub icon. Let's also add a width, which will be 50 pixels. And right under the width, we're going to add one more attribute, which will be the class of the image, which has the margin X of auto. It has a scale of 100 by default, but once we hover it, the scale will be 125. The transition will be ease in, and the duration will be 200 milliseconds. Now let's test it out. Let's navigate back to Google Chrome, refresh it, and right here, you will indeed see a GitHub logo right above the email input field. Now let's focus on the functionality right behind our GitHub button, because if we click on it right now, nothing happens. This needs to be handled through a package from Laravel itself, which you probably by now have heard of. It is called Laravel Socialite. And Laravel Socialite is basically a form-based authentication which is used to authenticate all auth providers. Think about apps such as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google, GitHub, and a couple more. Laravel has its official documentation for it as well, which I will link in the description down below. Now, just as Laravel Breeze, Laravel Socialite needs to be pulled in through Composer. So we need to navigate back to the CLI, where we need to run the composer require a package from Laravel /Socialite. Let's hit enter and let's give it a moment because it's pulling in Laravel Socialite. Alright, we obviously need to make sure that we add credentials from GitHub so we could interact with GitHub, which needs to be done right inside of the service configuration file, which can be found inside our project root, where we have a config directory and a services.php file. Right here, you will find default credentials for Mailgun, Postmark, and SES. For GitHub, we do need to add the same structure for credentials. First, we need to add a key such as Mailgun. This needs to be the name of your all auth provider. We're going to use GitHub, so let's add GitHub right here. And let's set it equal to an array. We're going to define 3 key value pairs. The first one will be client_ID, where the value will come from the env method, where it will look inside the .env file and search for a GitHub client ID variable. Then we need to duplicate the line of code, because the second key will be client_secret, where the env variable will be GitHub _client_secret. Duplicate it one more time, because the last env variable will be GitHub _callback_URI, where the key will be redirect. And the callback URI will basically be the destination after the GitHub login has been executed. Now the next step is obviously making sure that these 3 credentials exist inside our .env file. So let's open it. And let's say right above our database connection, we're going to define the GitHub _client_ID. We have the GitHub _client_secret. And we have our GitHub _callback_URI. Now GitHub allows you to add all auth applications through the settings where you could basically generate client information. And that way, GitHub knows which user is using the authentication system that you created. So let's navigate back to Google Chrome. Let's open a new tab and let's go to github.com. We could hit enter right here, but we could also add a /settings/developers, which will redirect her to our all auth applications. At the moment, GitHub is telling me that I have no all auth applications, but it's also showing me a button where I could create one. So let's click on register a new application, where we have an application name of, let's say, YouTube is Laravel Socialite login. The home page URL will be http:///127, so basically our local host. Keep in mind that using Laravel Valet and adding, let's say, github-login.test won't work. So the description can be empty. Then we have our authorized callback URI, which we can copy from the home page URL and simply add /auth/github/callback to it. So right now we are ready to register our application. So let's do that, which will redirect us to basically an overview page where you could also find your client ID right here, and you can generate your client secrets. I'll show you mine because I can't be bothered blurring it out, and I will also delete this all auth application anyways. So let's first make sure that we generate our client secret, where we need to add our password. So let's quickly do that. I don't want to save it in one password. All right. And what we could do right now is simply copy pasting the credentials into our .env file. So this is my client ID. We have the client secret, which we just generated. Paste it as our GitHub client secret. And then we have our callback URI, which will basically be the callback URI we added inside the input field. The last thing we need to pay attention to on our GitHub dashboard is right at the top. And that's the fact that we have 0 users right now. Once we try to log into our local application, it should change to 1 user. So this is something we will check later on. Right now, we are ready to focus on the logic inside our controller. This will actually be a tricky one, because there is not one method that's the best, or should be used. You could either update the verify email controller of Laravel Breeze and add the functionality inside the controller where the actual login process happens, or you could create a new controller where you'll add the logic. And for demonstration purposes, I'm simply going to create a new controller since I don't want to rebuild the entire verify email controller for a video. But if you do want to do that, which I completely understand and I would also highly recommend, just go for it. But for now, let's navigate back to the CLI and let's run the php artisan make controller command, and we're going to add a GitHub controller. Let's hit enter, navigate back to PHP Storm. Let's open our app directory, http controllers GitHub controller. We're basically going to define 2 methods. The first one will be named redirect. Well, we have a second one, which will be called callback. The redirect method at the top will simply redirect the user. Then for the second method, which is the callback method, will basically handle the user when logging in. Now, before we move on, we also need to make sure that we add our routes inside the web.php file inside the routes directory. So let's do that. Let's go right at the bottom. Let's define a new route, which is a get method. The URI will be auth/GitHub. Then we're going to pass in an array, which will be the controller. So our GitHub controller, class, which will be the redirect method. Now let me actually change this up a little bit. All right, now I can delete this. We're also going to add the name method to the route, since this route will be called once a user clicks on the GitHub image on our login screen, where it has a name of github.login. We also need to define a second method, which will be our GitHub callback. So let's do that right below, where the URI will be auth/GitHub/callback. So basically the route that we have defined inside GitHub as our authorized callback URI. Then we're going to add the same process. GitHub controller is the class where the method will be callback. And we don't need to add a named route right here because we're not going to use it right here. Now, before I forget it, let's move on to our login page and add the named route right here of github.login. Let's navigate back to our GitHub controller and let's focus on the redirect method first at the top, since we need to make sure that we redirect the user to the GitHub page once they click the GitHub image, so they could log in through GitHub. And it's pretty easy what we're going to do right here, since the real magic needs to happen inside the callback method. We're simply going to return the Socialite facade where we have access to the driver method. Inside the driver method, we need to pass in one parameter, which will be the driver that we're going to use. This could either be a new environment variable or just a static call to GitHub. So let's actually do that. Finally, we need to chain the redirect method to it so that the user gets redirected to GitHub's authentication page. Let me actually align it a little bit. All right. If we now navigate to the browser, refresh our local host, click on the GitHub icon or image, you will see that we have been redirected to github.com, where we have the option to sign in through GitHub, which will give us access to the Laravel Socialite login application that we created before. So basically our application right here. I'm not going to log in since we will run into some errors, but let's actually make sure that we write logic inside the callback method before we do that. We're going to start off with a try catch, where the catch method has an exception, variable e. The reason why we're using a try catch is because it allows us to test the login while the action is being executed. What we're going to do inside the try statement is first defining a new object named user, since we need to make sure that we pull in data from the user that is logging in. Now the value will basically be a call to our Socialite driver, grab the driver method, where the driver will be GitHub, and we're simply going to chain the user method to it, which will basically grab the model of the user that is trying to log in from GitHub. Now I'm actually going to use ray right here, so on the line below, I'm going to ray the user, so we could see what the user model of GitHub looks like. So let's navigate back to Google Chrome. Let's click on Authorized Code with ARI. We're being redirected, and inside Ray, you can see the user model from GitHub, which has the ID, the nickname, the name, email, avatar, the user, so a lot of data from GitHub, which we not necessarily need, but could be useful if you want to store, let's say, the company name, the user type, the location, and so on from a user. Now let's make sure that once a user has been pulled in from GitHub, so basically what we have done right here, we either update the data of an existing user or create a new user inside our database. So let's navigate back to our controller and let's remove our array. And let me actually add a couple spaces right here. All right. Then right below our user object, we're going to define a new getUser object, which will be equal to the user model, update or create, which is a pretty interesting method for this example. It basically tries to find a model which matches the array that is being passed through. So let's pass in an array. If it does find a match, it will update the attributes we're going to pass inside the array right here. So let's say that we only want to update the GitHub ID if the user exists and we only need to update it, which will come from our user object right here. And let me actually show it in Ray, which will be the ID right here at the top. So let's say user ID. But if there is no match inside our own database, we do need to make sure that the GitHub user will be stored inside our database, which can be done by adding a comma right after the array and passing in a second array, which will basically be performed once a user needs to be created. So the first array will be the update part, while the second one will be the create part. So when we want to persist a new user into our database, we do need to have more data than just a user ID, because our user model is saying that the name, it's not name, it's nickname, excuse me, email, password, GitHub ID, and auth type needs to be added. So let's say that the name is coming from the username. We have the nickname, which is coming from our user object nickname. We have the email, which we could also grab from GitHub. We have the GitHub underscore token. Now let's actually go back to Ray for a moment, which is this token right here. So let's say user token. Then we have the auth underscore type, which will basically be a static string of GitHub. And we have a password. And the password is required to add once we persist a user into our database. You can't change the column to nullable, because if a user tries to log in from the login screen through a username and password, it can't find a match because the password will be empty. So this can't be done. And I think that the best solution right here is to create a new hashed password. So let's make a call to the hash facade. We're gonna call the make method and we're gonna pass in the string facade, random amount of numbers of 10. All right, now let's navigate back to Google Chrome and let's actually go back to our local host. Click on login, click on our GitHub icon. It's loading right now, so it's making a request. And you'll see that we have been redirected to a white screen, but if we open GitHub, refresh it, you'll see that the user has been added inside our application. And this is happening because we haven't told the application that some action needs to be performed with the Git user. And what you actually want is saving it inside a session so Laravel Breeze knows that someone logged in. So let's navigate back to PHP Storm. We need to make a call to the auth facade, make a call to the login method, and we need to pass in our Git user right here, which will basically store the user inside its session, which will then tell Laravel Breeze that the user has been logged in, which will then need to be redirected to the dashboard. Then finally for our catch, we're simply gonna array the object E and we will get the message. All right, this is it. Let's walk through the entire process one more time. I'm also connected to my database, so let me quickly remove the user from my database. All right, let's quickly navigate to GitHub where we need to revoke all user tokens. All right, if we refresh it, you'll see that we have 0 users inside our application. Let's navigate back to our local host. Click on the GitHub icon. You'll see that it's asking us to authorize Laravel Socialite login with the user code with Dari. You will see that we have been redirected to our local host. We're logged in and we're located on our dashboard. Let's navigate back to PHP Storm, refresh our users table, where you will see that the user has been created. We've got the name, the nickname, the email. We have the password, we have the GitHub ID, we have the auth type, and well, that was actually it. Now this was it for this tutorial where we have implemented Laravel Socialite into our Laravel Breeze frontend scaffolding, which allowed us to use OAuth to log in users through GitHub. Once again, I'm currently working on a databases and Eloquent course which I will publish on Udemy. If you want to stay updated, make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube and follow me on Twitter and Instagram. This was it for this video. If you do like my content and you want to see more, please hit that subscribe button, and if you're new to this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well.